Close your eyes and imagine a world on the edge of chaos. A single gunshot in a small European city sets the stage for the deadliest war humanity had ever seen. From muddy trenches to soaring warplanes, from secret alliances to broken empires, this is not just history. It's the story of a world changed forever. Tonight, let me take you on a calm but powerful journey through the entire history of World War I, a journey of courage, tragedy, and the events that shaped the 20th century. Get comfortable, relax, and drift into sleep as the Great War unfolds before your ears. In the years before World War I began, the world looked very different from what we know today. Europe was the center of power, wealth, and influence. Great empires like Britain, France, Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Germany ruled vast territories, not only in Europe, but also across Asia, Africa, and other parts of the world. These empires competed fiercely with each other for land, resources, and power. On the surface, things seemed calm, but underneath, there was tension, rivalry, and fear. It was like a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. At the heart of Europe, countries were forming secret alliances to protect themselves. On one side was the Triple Entente, Britain, France, and Russia. On the other side was the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. These alliances were meant to keep peace, but in reality, they made things more dangerous. If one country was attacked, its allies promised to join the fight, which meant even a small conflict could quickly spread across the whole continent. Nationalism was another powerful force. People in many parts of Europe were proud of their nations and cultures, sometimes too proud. They wanted their countries to grow stronger, and some groups wanted independence from the empires that ruled them. For example, in the Balkans, a region in southeastern Europe, many ethnic groups wanted freedom from Austria-Hungary. This made the Balkans a very unstable place, often called the powder keg of Europe. At the same time, militarism was rising. Countries were building bigger armies, stronger navies, and new weapons. Germany, for example, challenged Britain's dominance at sea by building modern battleships. France and Germany competed to have the largest armies on the continent. This arms race created fear and suspicion. Nations believed that if war broke out, it would be fast and glorious. No one could imagine the long, brutal struggle that was coming. The early 1900s were also a time of new inventions in technology. Airplanes were brand new, automobiles were becoming more common, and machine guns had become deadly tools of war. This mix of old ideas like honor and glory in battle with new industrial weapons created a dangerous situation. Leaders still thought of war as something fought by brave men on horseback with swords. They didn't yet realize that modern technology would turn battlefields into slaughterhouses. Meanwhile, ordinary people across Europe lived their lives, unaware of how close disaster was. In London, Paris, Berlin, and Vienna, people filled the streets with music, fashion, and culture. There were theaters, dances, and a growing sense of modern life. In rural areas, farmers worked the land just as their ancestors had for centuries. Nobody expected that soon, millions of these men would be called to fight in trenches filled with mud, blood, and death. The world before World War I was a mix of old traditions and new changes. There was pride, ambition, and competition everywhere. But there was also fear of falling behind, fear of being invaded, and fear of losing power. All it took was a single spark to set this world on fire. The fuse that lit the fire of World War I came from an unexpected place: the city of Sarajevo in the Balkans. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife Sophie were visiting the city. Their visit was supposed to show strength and unity, but instead, it became the moment that set the entire world on a path to war. Sarajevo was in Bosnia, a region that Austria-Hungary had taken over years earlier. Many people there were angry because they wanted independence or hoped to join with neighboring Serbia, a country filled with Slavic people who shared their language and culture. To them, Franz Ferdinand was not a welcome guest, but a symbol of foreign control. A secret group of Serbian nationalists called the Black Hand planned an attack. Their goal was to kill the Archduke and send a message that the Slavic people would no longer be ruled by Austria-Hungary. Among them was a young man named Gavrilo Princip, only 19 years old. He and others armed themselves with bombs and pistols, waiting along the Archduke's route. The morning started with chaos. As Franz Ferdinand's car passed by, one of the assassins threw a grenade. The bomb bounced off the car and exploded under another vehicle, injuring several people. The Archduke was shaken, but not harmed. Adon. He insisted on continuing the visit, showing courage and calm in front of the crowds. Adon. The assassins thought they had failed, but fate had other plans. Later that day, the Archduke wanted to visit the wounded in the hospital. His driver took a wrong turn and slowed down to change direction. By pure chance, the car stopped right in front of Gavrilo Princip, who was standing nearby. Princip pulled out his pistol and fired 2 shots. The first struck Sophie, and the second hit Franz Ferdinand. Within minutes, both were dead. The assassination shocked Europe. It's Austria-Hungary. This was not just a crime, it was an insult to the empire itself. Leaders in Vienna blamed Serbia, believing its government had supported the killers. Serbia denied direct involvement. But many in Europe agreed that Serbia had at least encouraged the nationalist spirit that inspired the attack. At first, it looked like the crisis might be contained. Assassinations were not uncommon in the early 1900s, and many times they did not lead to major wars. But this time was different. Austria-Hungary saw the chance to punish Serbia once and for all. Germany, its powerful ally, gave Austria-Hungary a blank check, promising full support no matter what. On the other side, Russia felt it had to protect Serbia, a fellow Slavic nation. France, allied with Russia, would also be drawn in. And Britain, though hesitant, would soon have no choice. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand was like striking a match in a room full of gunpowder. The alliances, rivalries, and tensions that had built up for years were ready to explode. A single young man's bullets would set in motion a chain of events that dragged the entire world into war. In the weeks after the assassination, Europe entered what historians call the July crisis, a month of threats, ultimatums, and mobilizations. Leaders thought they could act quickly and decisively to gain power. Instead, they set the stage for the bloodiest conflict humanity had ever known. After the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, on June 28, 1914, Europe entered one of the tensest months in history. Historians call it the July crisis, a period when telegrams, ultimatums, and military plans flew across Europe at lightning speed. What began as a local conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia quickly spread into a full-scale global war because of the complex web of alliances and rivalries. Austria-Hungary was furious. Its leaders felt that Serbia had encouraged the terrorists who killed the Archduke. They wanted revenge. But Austria-Hungary was not strong enough to act alone. It needed Germany's support. Germany quickly gave what historians call the blank check. This meant that no matter what Austria-Hungary decided to do, Germany promised full military backing. With this confidence, Austria-Hungary prepared to confront Serbia. On July 23, 1914, Austria-Hungary delivered a harsh ultimatum to Serbia. The list of demands was almost impossible to accept. Serbia had to allow Austrian officials to investigate within its borders, punish those involved in the assassination, and stop all anti-Austrian propaganda. It was designed in such a way that Serbia could not fully agree without giving up its independence. Serbia tried to accept most of the demands but refused the ones that violated its sovereignty. Austria-Hungary saw this as rejection. On July 28th, exactly 1 month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. This was the spark that set the alliances into motion. Russia, seeing itself as the protector of all Slavic peoples, could not allow Serbia to be crushed. Tsar Nicholas II ordered his armies to begin mobilization against Austria-Hungary. Germany, in turn, felt threatened by Russia's moves. Germany's leaders feared a two-front war, fighting Russia in the east and France in the west. To prevent this, Germany acted quickly and aggressively. On August 1, 1914, Germany declared war on Russia. Just 2 days later, Germany declared war on France as well. But to strike France quickly, Germany needed to pass through neutral Belgium. This led to one of the most important moments of the early war, the violation of Belgium's neutrality. Belgium was a small, neutral country, but its location was strategic. Germany believed it could march through Belgium, defeat France in a few weeks, and then turn to face Russia. But Germany underestimated the consequences. Britain had promised to protect Belgium's neutrality since the 1830s. When German troops invaded Belgium on August 4th, Britain declared war on Germany. Within just a few days, the whole continent was at war. Austria-Hungary against Serbia, Germany against Russia and France, Britain against Germany. Soon, other nations like Japan and the Ottoman Empire would join. What could have been a regional conflict in the Balkans had spiraled into a world war. The July crisis shows how fragile peace in Europe really was. Each country believed it had to act quickly or risk being defeated. Leaders thought the war would be short, perhaps over by Christmas. None of them realized that they had just unleashed 4 years of unimaginable destruction, suffering, and loss of life. At the end of that summer, the armies of Europe were on the move. Millions of young men marched off to fight, many of them smiling, waving flags, and believing they would return home victorious in a matter of weeks. They had no idea that the world they left behind would never be the same again. When Germany declared war in August 1914, its leaders already had a detailed strategy ready to go. This was called the Schlieffen Plan, named after General Alfred von Schlieffen, who had designed it years earlier. Germany's leaders knew that if war came, they would have to fight both France in the west and Russia in the east at the same time. They feared being crushed between two powerful enemies. The Schlieffen Plan was their solution, a lightning-fast attack that would knock France out of the war before Russia could fully mobilize its huge army. The plan was bold and risky. German armies would sweep through neutral Belgium, swing down into France from the north, capture Paris, and defeat the French within 6 weeks. After that, Germany could turn its full attention to fighting Russia in the east. German leaders believed that Belgium would offer little resistance and that Britain might stay out of the war. Both of those assumptions turned out to be disastrously wrong. On August 4th, 1914, German forces invaded Belgium. To the world's surprise, the Belgians fought back fiercely. Their small but determined army slowed the German advance, destroying railways and bridges to delay the invaders. This resistance gave Britain time to react. Outraged by the violation of Belgian neutrality, Britain declared war on Germany. Now the conflict was truly global, with Britain's empire stretching across the world. The German advance into France was brutal and fast. Cities and towns were destroyed, and civilians suffered terribly. Yet the French army, with British forces now at their side, refused to give in. In September 1914, at the Battle of the Marne, the Allies launched a desperate counterattack. French taxis were famously used to rush soldiers to the front lines. Against all odds, the Allies stopped the German advance just 30 miles from Paris. The Schlieffen Plan had failed. Germany would not win a quick victory. Instead, both sides began digging trenches to protect themselves from machine gun fire and artillery bombardments. This marked the beginning of a new kind of warfare. Trench warfare would dominate the Western Front for the next 4 years. Life in the trenches was harsh and miserable. Soldiers lived in mud-filled ditches, often surrounded by rats and plagued by disease. They faced constant danger from shells, snipers, and poison gas. The ground between the two trench systems, known as no man's land, was a deadly wasteland of barbed wire, shell craters, and corpses. Any attempt to cross it usually ended in slaughter. Despite the grim conditions, soldiers tried to maintain their humanity. Letters from home, songs, and friendships helped them survive. Still, the sense of fear and exhaustion was overwhelming. The Western Front soon became a war of stalemate, where neither side could gain much ground, despite massive attacks. The failure of the Schlieffen Plan changed the entire course of World War I. Instead of a quick German victory, the war turned into a long, drawn-out struggle that drained men and resources from all sides. Millions of soldiers and civilians would now be caught in a deadly conflict that seemed to have no end in sight. While the Western Front quickly settled into trenches and stalemate, the Eastern Front was very different. Stretching from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south, it covered vast distances across Eastern Europe. Unlike the muddy, narrow battle lines of France and Belgium, the Eastern Front was wide and open. Armies here were spread across hundreds of miles, and battles involved massive movements, rather than soldiers being trapped in trenches. In August 1914, As Germany fought in Belgium and France, Russia mobilized faster than expected. This shocked Germany's leaders, who had believed it would take Russia months to prepare its huge army. Within weeks, Russian soldiers poured into East Prussia, threatening German territory. The German high command panicked, but two brilliant generals, Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, were called in to take charge. The result was the Battle of Tannenberg, one of the most dramatic clashes of the war. Using superior planning, railroads, and intercepted Russian communications, Germany encircled and destroyed the Russian Second Army. Over 90,000 Russian soldiers were captured, and tens of thousands more were killed or wounded. Just days later, Germany crushed another Russian force at the Battle of the Masurian Lakes. These early defeats devastated Russian morale and proved that, despite its size, the Russian army was poorly equipped and badly led. But the Eastern Front was not a one-sided affair. Russia, with its enormous population, could raise new armies quickly. It launched offensives not only against Germany, but also against Austria-Hungary. Unlike Germany, Austria-Hungary's military was weak and disorganized. In Galicia, Russian forces smashed through Austrian defenses, capturing large areas of land and tens of thousands of prisoners. Austria-Hungary soon found itself relying heavily on Germany to survive. The battles in the East were not only about soldiers. They also involved civilians in a terrible way. Millions of people living in Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltic regions were caught in the fighting. Entire villages were burned, and civilians were forced to flee as armies advanced and retreated across the same lands again and again. Disease, hunger, and cold winters added to the suffering. Unlike the Western Front, where the lines hardly moved, the Eastern Front saw dramatic swings. In one year, an army might advance hundreds of miles, only to be pushed back later. This made the fighting unpredictable and chaotic. Cavalry units, which were nearly useless in the trenches of France, still played an important role here, scouting and raiding across the open fields. By the end of 1915, the Central Powers Germany, Austria-Hungary, and later joined by the Ottoman Empire, managed to push Russia back in what became known as the Great Retreat. The Russian army lost territory, equipment, and millions of men. The defeat shook confidence in the Russian government and weakened Tsar Nicholas II's rule. These problems would later explode into revolution. The Eastern Front showed a very different side of World War I. It was a war of movement, sweeping offensives, and enormous casualties. It drained both men and resources, but it also revealed the cracks in the Russian Empire. Unlike in the West, where soldiers huddled in trenches, the Eastern War tore across entire nations, leaving destruction on a scale Europe had rarely seen before. While millions of soldiers fought on land in Europe, another battle was taking place across the world's oceans. Control of the seas was just as important as victory on the battlefield. Nations relied on ships to carry food, weapons, and supplies. If those supplies were cut off, armies and civilians alike could starve. During World War I, the seas became a deadly arena where battleships, submarines, and merchant vessels all played their part. At the start of the war, Britain had the world's strongest navy. For centuries, the Royal Navy had been the pride of the British Empire. Germany, however, had spent years building up its fleet to challenge Britain. This naval arms race was one of the causes of tension before the war. When the fighting began, both sides prepared for a massive clash at sea. But the war at sea was not just about big battleships. Britain decided to use its navy to blockade Germany. British ships surrounded German ports and stopped supplies from reaching the country. Food, fuel, and raw materials became scarce. The blockade slowly strangled Germany's economy and hurt ordinary German families. Bread grew scarce, meat was rationed, and hunger spread. The blockade was one of Britain's most powerful weapons, but it also caused suffering to millions of civilians. Germany answered with a weapon that shocked the world: the U-boat or submarine. Unlike traditional warships, submarines could travel underwater and strike without warning. German U-boats began attacking merchant ships, bringing supplies to Britain. At first, they followed rules by warning ships before attacking. But soon, Germany turned to unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking any ship, military or civilian, that helped the Allies. One of the most famous incidents happened in May 1915. when a German U-boat sank the Lusitania. A British passenger ship, nearly 1,200 people were killed, including more than 100 Americans. The sinking shocked the world and turned public opinion against Germany. Though the United States did not immediately join the war, this event planted the seeds of American involvement later. The biggest traditional naval battle of the war was the Battle of Jutland in 1916. It was fought between the British Royal Navy and the German High Seas Fleet. The battle involved over 250 ships and was the largest sea clash of the war. Both sides claimed victory, but in the end, the British blockade remained in place, and the German fleet stayed mostly trapped in port for the rest of the conflict. The war at sea was not limited to Europe. Since the British and French empires stretched across the globe, naval battles were also fought in the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and even in faraway places like the Pacific and Indian Oceans. German colonies and outposts were attacked, and trade routes became battlegrounds. The struggle on the oceans showed how modern technology had changed warfare. Submarines made the seas more dangerous than ever, and blockades turned hunger into a weapon. For soldiers at the front, the war meant mud and trenches. For sailors and civilians, it meant long voyages under the constant threat of sudden attack. By the end of the war, Britain's blockade had nearly starved Germany into submission, while German U-boats had sunk thousands of ships. The war at sea may not have had as many famous battles as the war on land, but it played a crucial role in deciding the outcome of World War I. When the Western Front froze into lines of trenches in late 1914, soldiers discovered that the war would not be quick or glorious. Instead, it became a slow, grinding struggle fought from ditches dug into the earth. These trenches stretched for hundreds of miles, from the coast of Belgium down through France. Life inside them was harsh, dirty, and dangerous, and it shaped the daily experience of millions of men. A trench was more than just a hole in the ground. Each side dug long networks with frontline trenches, support trenches, and reserve lines. The front line was closest to the enemy, where soldiers kept watch day and night. Behind it, the support trenches held supplies and extra men. Communication trenches linked everything together like a giant underground city. Still, the conditions were terrible. The ground was wet and muddy, especially in Belgium and northern France, where rain turned the fields into swamps. Soldiers stood for hours in cold water, which often led to a painful condition known as trench foot. Feet swelled, turned black, and sometimes had to be amputated. Rats and lice were everywhere. Rats grew fat, feeding on food scraps, and even the bodies of dead soldiers. Lice caused constant itching and spread disease. Cleanliness was nearly impossible. Everyday routines were exhausting. Soldiers woke before dawn to prepare for possible attacks, as dawn was the most likely time for an enemy assault. They ate simple, repetitive meals like hard biscuits, tinned meat, and watery soup. Fresh food was rare, and drinking water often tasted of chlorine or mud. Letters from home were one of the few comforts. Receiving a package with chocolate, socks, or cigarettes could lift a soldier's spirits for days. The constant threat of death was always present. Enemy snipers targeted anyone who raised their head above the trench line. Artillery shells rained down day and night, shaking the earth and causing terrible casualties. Poison gas, first used in 1915, added a new horror. Clouds of chlorine or mustard gas drifted silently across the trenches, burning lungs and skin. Soldiers had to wear hot, uncomfortable gas masks, sometimes for hours at a time. When attacks were ordered, life became even more terrifying. Soldiers had to climb out of the trench and go over the top, charging across no man's land. This wasteland was filled with barbed wire, craters, and dead bodies. Machine guns and artillery cut down thousands of men in minutes. Victories were rare, and even when ground was gained, it was often just a few hundred yards at the cost of thousands of lives. Yet despite the misery, soldiers formed strong bonds with each other. They relied on their comrades for survival and found ways to endure. Singing songs, playing cards, or sharing jokes helped them escape the fear for a little while. These friendships, called trench brotherhoods, gave men the strength to face another day in such awful conditions. Life in the trenches was a mix of boredom and terror. Days could pass with little action, followed suddenly by hours of chaos and death. For many soldiers, the war became less about patriotism or glory and more about simple survival, living through each day and hoping to return home. The trenches turned the Great War into a nightmare that scarred a whole generation. As the war dragged on, the Western Front became a place of massive offensives, where millions of men fought and died for just a few miles of land. Two of the most famous and deadliest battles of World War I were Verdun and the Somme. These battles showed the world the true horror of modern warfare and symbolized the suffering of an entire generation. The Battle of Verdun began in February 1916. Germany's leaders wanted to bleed France white by attacking a place that the French would never abandon. They chose Verdun, an old fortress city with great symbolic importance. The Germans believed the French would throw everything they had into defending it, and in the process, their army would be destroyed. The battle lasted nearly 10 months, making it the longest of the war. German artillery bombarded the French lines with millions of shells, turning the landscape into a wasteland of craters. The French, under General Philippe, held their ground with the famous cry, "Ils ne passeront pas." The fighting was relentless, with attacks and counterattacks back and forth. By the end, both sides suffered enormous casualties. About 300,000 men were killed and hundreds of thousands more wounded. Yet Verdun did not break France. Instead, it became a symbol of French determination and sacrifice. While Verdun was still raging, the Allies launched another huge offensive, the Battle of the Somme, which began in July 1916. This battle was meant to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun and to break through the German lines. British and French forces joined together in what was supposed to be a decisive attack. The battle began with one of the heaviest bombardments in history. For a week, Allied artillery fired over 1 million shells at the German trenches, hoping to destroy barbed wire, machine guns, and bunkers. Soldiers believed the bombardment would wipe out the enemy, making it easy to walk across no man's land. But the Germans had dug deep shelters and survived the attack. On July 1, 1916, British soldiers went over the top in waves. It became the bloodiest day in British military history. Nearly 60,000 British soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing in just one day. Despite the massive losses, the battle dragged on for months. Tanks were used for the first time in combat, but they often broke down or got stuck in the mud. Airplanes played a bigger role too, spotting enemy positions and engaging in dogfights. By the time the Somme ended in November, over 1 million men from both sides had been killed or wounded. The Allies gained only a few miles of ground. The battle showed that huge offensives and new weapons still could not break the stalemate of trench warfare. Verdun and the Somme became symbols of the futility and suffering of World War I. Millions of young men were thrown into battlefields that swallowed lives without mercy. These battles taught a grim lesson. In this new age of industrial war, victory would not come through quick attacks, but through years of endurance, sacrifice, and unimaginable loss. World War I was often called the war to end all wars, not just because of its scale, because it introduced new technologies that changed the very nature of warfare. Before 1914, many people imagined battles as brave cavalry charges and soldiers marching with rifles. But this war became a brutal test of machines, industry, and science. It was the first truly modern war, where technology often mattered more than courage. One of the most feared weapons was the machine gun. Unlike rifles that fired one bullet at a time, machine guns could fire hundreds of rounds per minute. A few men with a machine gun could stop an entire line of advancing soldiers. That's why so many attacks across no man's land ended in disaster. Waves of men were cut down before they could even reach the enemy trenches. The machine gun turned offense into near suicide and was one of the main reasons trench warfare became a stalemate. Another horrifying invention was poison gas. First used by Germany at the Battle of Ypres in 1915, gas added a new level of terror to the battlefield. Chlorine gas burned the lungs, causing soldiers to choke to death. Later, mustard gas was developed, which blistered the skin and blinded its victims. Gas attacks were unpredictable. Wind could blow the gas back onto the side that released it. Soldiers had to wear heavy, uncomfortable gas masks, sometimes for hours, just to survive. Poison gas killed fewer men than bullets or shells, but its psychological impact was immense. Artillery also reached new levels of destruction. Huge guns could fire shells miles behind enemy lines, raining down constant bombardment. Entire landscapes were torn apart. Soldiers lived under the constant fear of random shell fire, which could strike at any moment. Some shells contained explosives, while others spread shrapnel that shredded anyone nearby. The endless thunder of artillery was so intense that soldiers often suffered shell shock, what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Despite the stalemate, new inventions were tested to try to break through. The British introduced the tank in 1916 at the Battle of the Somme. Tanks were heavily armored vehicles that could roll over barbed wire and cross trenches. Early tanks were slow, hot, and unreliable. They often broke down before reaching battle. But they showed potential. And by the end of the war, improved models became a powerful weapon. In the skies, airplanes transformed warfare. At first, they were used mainly for reconnaissance, spotting enemy positions and directing artillery fire. But soon, planes were armed with machine guns and bombs, leading to the first dogfights in history. Famous pilots, known as aces, became heroes. The most legendary was Germany's Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, who shot down over 80 enemy planes before being killed in 1918. Another major weapon was the submarine or U-boat, especially for Germany. While not used on land, submarines turned the oceans into a new battlefield, sinking supply ships that kept Britain alive. World War I showed that technology had made war deadlier than ever before. The courage of soldiers mattered, but machines and weapons often decided who lived and who died. The combination of machine guns, gas, artillery, tanks, and airplanes created a nightmare world that no one had imagined in 1914. It was a new kind of war, industrial, mechanical, and devastating. Although most people imagine World War I as trench fighting in France and Belgium, the conflict spread far beyond Europe. Because the great empires controlled colonies across the globe, the war became a truly worldwide struggle. Battles erupted in Turkey, the Middle East, Africa, and even Asia. Millions of soldiers from colonies were drawn into the fighting, making it one of the most global wars in history. One of the most famous campaigns outside Europe was Gallipoli, fought on the Gallipoli Peninsula in modern-day Turkey. In 1915, the Allies planned to break the stalemate by opening a new front. They hoped to capture the Dardanelles Strait, a vital waterway that connected the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. By doing this, they could supply Russia more easily and even knock the Ottoman Empire, Germany's ally, out of the war. British, French, Australian, and New Zealand troops, the Anzacs, landed on the rocky beaches of Gallipoli. But the Ottomans, led by a determined commander named Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, fought fiercely. The cliffs and narrow beaches gave the defenders a huge advantage. What was supposed to be a quick victory turned into a nightmare of trench warfare, disease, and heavy losses. After months of fighting, the Allies withdrew in defeat. Gallipoli became a symbol of courage and sacrifice for Australia and New Zealand, shaping their national identities. The war also spread into the Middle East. Here, the British encouraged Arab leaders to rise up against the Ottoman Empire. This became the Arab Revolt of 1916, led by figures such as Sharif Hussein and famously supported by T.E. Lawrence, known as Lawrence of Arabia. Using guerrilla tactics, Arab fighters attacked Ottoman railways, supply lines, and garrisons. Their efforts, combined with British advances from Egypt, eventually helped weaken Ottoman control of the region. In Africa, battles broke out in the colonies of Germany, Britain, France, and Belgium. African soldiers and laborers were drawn into the conflict, often against their will. They fought in harsh conditions, not only against enemy troops, but also against disease and hunger. In German East Africa, the brilliant German commander Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck led a long guerrilla campaign, tying down Allied forces until the very end of the war. Millions of Africans suffered during the war, with famine and forced labor leaving lasting scars. In Asia and the Pacific, Japan entered the war on the side of the Allies. Japanese forces quickly seized German colonies in China and the Pacific Islands. Though Japan gained territory, its ambitions also worried its European allies, planting seeds of tension for the future. The global nature of World War I showed how connected the world had become by 1914. Soldiers from India, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Africa, and other parts of the world fought and died thousands of miles from their homes. The war was not just a European tragedy, it reshaped the political and social map of many regions. By the time these faraway campaigns ended, entire empires like the Ottoman Empire were crumbling. The war beyond Europe proved that no corner of the globe was untouched, and it ensured that the consequences of the conflict would be felt worldwide for decades to come. When World War I began in 1914, the United States stayed neutral. President Woodrow Wilson believed America should remain apart from Europe's quarrels. Most Americans agreed. The war seemed far away, and the U.S. had no formal obligation to join either side. Instead, the country focused on trade, sending food, weapons, and supplies to Europe. But as the years passed, events slowly pulled America into the conflict. One of the biggest reasons was Germany's use of unrestricted submarine warfare. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking ships that carried supplies to Britain and France. At first, Germany promised not to attack passenger ships. But in May 1915, a German submarine sank the British liner Lusitania. Nearly 1,200 people were killed, including more than 100 Americans. The tragedy shocked the world and turned American opinion against Germany. Although Wilson still hoped to keep the U.S. out of war, Germany's actions continued to provoke anger. In 1917, Germany announced it would resume unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking any ship bound for Britain even if Americans were on board. This was a direct challenge to U.S. neutrality and threatened American lives and trade. Another major turning point was the Zimmermann telegram. In early 1917, British intelligence intercepted a secret message from German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to Mexico. The telegram promised that if Mexico joined Germany in the war against the U.S., it would regain lost territories Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico after victory. When the British revealed this to the Americans, outrage swept across the country. The idea that Germany was encouraging attacks on U.S. soil made war seem unavoidable. At the same time, events in Russia also influenced the decision. In March 1917, the Russian Tsar was overthrown in the February Revolution. A new provisional government took power, claiming it would continue fighting Germany. For Wilson, who believed in making the world safe for democracy, this was important. Now, the Allies were all democratic nations, while the Central Powers Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire looked more like dictatorships. On April 2, 1917, President Wilson went before Congress and asked for a declaration of war. He said, "The world must be made safe for democracy." 4 days later, Congress approved, and the United States officially entered the war on the side of the Allies. At first, America's military was small compared to the massive European armies. But the U.S. had something more powerful: fresh troops, vast resources, and industrial strength. Within a year, over 2 million American soldiers, known as the American Expeditionary Forces (AEF) under General John J. Pershing, were sent to Europe. They brought energy, confidence, and much-needed manpower to the exhausted Allies. For the American people, entering the war meant major changes. Factories shifted to war production. Women took on new roles in the workforce, and propaganda encouraged unity and sacrifice. Many saw it as a chance to prove America's strength on the world stage. The entry of the United States was a turning point. After years of stalemate, the arrival of American troops and supplies gave the Allies the edge they desperately needed. Germany now faced not only Britain, France, and Italy, but also a powerful new opponent with nearly unlimited resources. The tide of the war was beginning to shift. While soldiers fought on distant battlefields, millions of civilians across Europe and beyond faced their own struggles. World War I was not just fought in trenches. It reached into homes, factories, and farms, shaping daily life in ways people had never experienced before. The home front became a vital part of the war effort as governments demanded total commitment from their citizens. One of the biggest changes was rationing and shortages. In Britain, Germany, France, and other nations, food became scarce as blockades cut off supplies. Families had to adjust to smaller portions of bread, meat, sugar, and butter. In Germany, the British naval blockade caused widespread hunger to keep armies supplied. Factories switched to war production. Men who once built cars, tools, or consumer goods now produced weapons, shells, and uniforms. Since so many men were away fighting, women stepped into roles that had been closed to them before. Women worked in munitions factories, ran farms, drove buses, and even joined military support units as nurses and clerks. This shift changed society, proving that women could perform jobs once considered suitable only for men. After the war, this would fuel demands for women's rights, including the right to vote. Governments also expanded their power over daily life. Propaganda became a powerful tool to control public opinion. Posters urged men to enlist, women to support the troops, and everyone to save food and fuel. In Britain, slogans like "Your country needs you" were plastered everywhere. In Germany, propaganda painted the Allies as enemies who wanted to destroy the German people. Newspapers, films, and speeches were carefully censored to keep morale high. Civilians also faced danger from the war itself. For the first time, cities far from the front lines were attacked. In Britain, German Zeppelins' huge airships dropped bombs on London and other towns, killing hundreds. Later, long-range artillery and airplanes increased the threat. People realized that modern war could reach them no matter where they lived. Meanwhile, in countries like Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Germany, the strain of war created unrest. Food shortages, inflation, and endless casualties led to protests and strikes. Many civilians grew tired of sacrifice and began questioning whether the war was worth it. This anger would eventually explode into revolutions, especially in Russia. Across the Atlantic, the United States also mobilized its home front after 1917. The government encouraged citizens to buy war bonds to finance the conflict. Families were asked to conserve food in meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays. The war touched every household, creating a sense of unity, but also hardship. For civilians, World War I was a constant struggle of endurance. It meant empty stomachs, long workdays, and the loss of loved ones at the front. Yet their efforts were crucial. Without the support of workers, farmers, and families, the armies could not have survived. The home front showed that modern war was no longer just about soldiers, it was about entire nations being mobilized for survival. By 1917, the Great War had dragged on for more than 3 years, and the weight of endless fighting, shortages, and death was crushing entire societies. The conflict did not only destroy lives on the battlefield, it also tore apart some of the world's empires. The strain of war toppled monarchs, fueled revolutions, and redrew the map of Europe and the Middle East. The first empire to collapse was Russia. The Russian army had suffered catastrophic losses on the Eastern Front, with millions of soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. At home, food shortages and inflation created desperation. Ordinary Russians stood in bread lines for hours, while soldiers at the front lacked boots, rifles, and even ammunition. Anger against Tsar Nicholas II boiled over in March 1917 during the February Revolution. Strikes and protests in Petrograd. Now, St. Petersburg forced the Tsar to abdicate. Provisional government took power, promising reform and a continued war effort. But the new government failed to end the suffering. Later that year, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized control in the October Revolution. Their slogan was simple: peace, land, bread. They promised to pull Russia out of the war, give land to peasants, and feed the hungry. True to their word, the Bolsheviks signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany in March 1918, ending Russia's involvement. This allowed Germany to move more troops to the Western Front, but it also marked the birth of the Soviet Union. Elsewhere, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was crumbling. The empire was a patchwork of ethnic groups: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Serbs, Croats, and many others. Each group had its own language, culture, and growing desire for independence. The war worsened old tensions. By 1918, hunger and defeat had shattered loyalty to the empire. Soldiers deserted, strikes paralyzed cities, and nationalist leaders declared independence. When the war ended, Austria-Hungary broke apart into several new countries, including Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The Ottoman Empire also faced collapse. Known as the sick man of Europe, it had already been weak before the war. Fighting on multiple fronts against the Russians in the Caucasus, the British in the Middle East, and Arab rebels from within proved too much. The Arab Revolt of 1916, supported by Britain, spread across the desert. While British forces captured key cities like Jerusalem and Damascus, by 1918, the Ottoman Empire was defeated. After the war, much of its territory was divided between Britain and France. While Turkish nationalists under Mustafa Kemal fought to create a new nation, Turkey. Even Germany, the strongest of the Central Powers, was shaken. By late 1918, German civilians faced starvation due to the Allied blockade. Strikes and protests erupted across the country. Soldiers refused orders. In November 1918, with defeat certain, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled into exile. Germany became a republic, known as the Weimar Republic. The Great War was not only about battles, it was about the destruction of old political systems. The Russian, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, German empires, all of them, centuries old, collapsed under the pressure of modern industrial war. In their place rose new nations and new governments, many unstable, that would shape the troubled decades ahead. By early 1918, the war had dragged on for nearly 4 years. Millions were dead, empires were collapsing, and soldiers on all sides were exhausted. Yet, Germany saw one last chance for victory. With Russia out of the war, after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Germany could now move hundreds of thousands of troops from the Eastern Front to the west. The German High Command hoped to strike a decisive blow before American forces arrived in full strength. This desperate gamble became known as the Spring Offensive, or the Kaiserschlacht, Kaiser's Battle. The offensive began in March 1918 with a massive attack along the Western Front. German forces used new stormtrooper tactics, small, fast-moving units that slipped through weak points in the enemy line, avoiding strong defenses and striking from behind. For the first time in years, the Germans broke through Allied lines, pushing deep into France. Villages and towns long fought over were captured in days. The Allies, shocked by the speed of the assault, fell back. Paris itself seemed under threat, but while the offensives gained ground, they came at a terrible cost. German soldiers advanced quickly, but often outran their supplies. Food, ammunition, and reinforcements could not keep up. The men were exhausted, and morale was weakening. The Allies, though battered, held firm. French General Ferdinand Foch was appointed Supreme Allied Commander, uniting British, French, and later American forces under a single strategy. By summer 1918, fresh American troops were arriving in huge numbers. Unlike the tired European armies, the Americans were well-fed, energetic, and eager to fight. At the Battle of Cantigny and later at Château-Thierry and Belleau Wood, U.S. forces proved their strength, stopping German advances and boosting Allied morale. The famous U.S. Marines at Belleau would earn the nickname Devil Dogs from the Germans for their fierce fighting. In July 1918, the Allies launched their counterattack in the Second Battle of the Marne. This marked the turning point. German offensives were halted, and the Allies began to push back. From then on, the Germans were on the defensive. With tanks now being used more effectively, along with coordinated attacks from infantry, artillery, and aircraft, the Allies regained ground at a steady pace. The period from August to November 1918 became known as the 100 Days Offensive. In battle after battle, German lines collapsed. The Allies recaptured territory across France and Belgium. Tanks rumbled forward, airplanes dominated the skies, and relentless artillery pounded German positions. The German army, once feared as the strongest in the world, was now retreating everywhere. Back in Germany, the home front was falling apart. Starvation from the British blockade, strikes, and protests weakened the war effort. Soldiers grew tired of fighting and began deserting in large numbers. Germany's allies, Austria-Hungary, the Ottomans, and Bulgaria, were collapsing one by one. Germany stood alone. By the fall of 1918, German leaders knew the war was lost. The Spring Offensive, meant to deliver victory, had instead drained their last strength. The Allies, reinforced by America and united under strong leadership, had turned the tide. The question was no longer whether Germany could win, but how and when the war would finally end. By the autumn of 1918, the German army was collapsing. The Spring Offensive had failed. The 100 Days Offensive had forced them back. and fresh American troops were arriving every day. Germany's allies were surrendering one after another. Bulgaria signed an armistice in September. The Ottoman Empire gave up in October. Austria-Hungary followed in early November. Germany stood alone, starving at home and beaten on the battlefield. Inside Germany, the situation was exploding. The British naval blockade had left food supplies desperately low. Bread was scarce, meat was almost gone, and civilians were surviving on potatoes, turnips, and substitutes. Disease spread quickly. Anger boiled over into strikes and protests. In Kiel, German sailors mutinied, refusing to fight a hopeless final battle. This revolt spread to cities across the country, where workers and soldiers set up councils and demanded peace. Meanwhile, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Germany's emperor, lost all authority. On November 9, 1918, he abdicated the throne and fled into exile in the Netherlands. Germany declared itself a republic. With the monarchy gone and revolution in the streets, the new German leaders had no choice but to seek peace. On November 11, 1918, representatives from Germany met the Allies in a railway carriage in the forest in France. There, they signed the armistice, which was an agreement to stop fighting. The terms were harsh. Germany had to withdraw from all occupied territories, surrender its weapons, and accept Allied control of parts of its land. Though not yet a formal peace treaty, it was clear that Germany had been defeated. The armistice was set to take effect at 11 a.m. on November 11th, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. In the final minutes before the ceasefire, fighting continued, and tragically, soldiers were still killed even though peace was only moments away. But when the hour struck, the guns finally fell silent after more than 4 years of thunder. The world had never known such relief. In Paris, London, and New York, people poured into the streets to celebrate. Bells rang, flags waved, and crowds cheered. After years of death and despair, there was finally hope. Yet for many, the joy was mixed with grief. Almost every family had lost someone, and millions of men lay buried in foreign fields. Entire cities were in ruins. The war had ended, but the scars would remain forever. The armistice of 1918 did not solve all problems. It was just a pause until a formal peace treaty could be written. Still, it marked the true end of the fighting. Soldiers laid down their rifles, trenches were abandoned, and the long nightmare of the Great War was finally over. For the survivors, November 11th became a sacred date, remembered as Armistice Day or Remembrance Day, a time to honor the dead and reflect on the cost of war. The world hoped such destruction would never happen again. Sadly, as history would later show, the peace would not last. When the guns fell silent on November 11, 1918, the world celebrated the end of fighting. The question remained, how should peace be made? Millions were dead, entire empires had collapsed, and the world longed for stability. In 1919, leaders of the victorious Allied powers gathered in France to decide the future. Their meeting became known as the Paris Peace Conference, and its most famous outcome was the Treaty of Versailles. The conference was dominated by the Big Four: Woodrow Wilson of the United States, Georges Clemenceau of France, David Lloyd George of Britain, and Vittorio Orlando of Italy. Each came with different goals. Wilson wanted a fair and lasting peace based on his 14 points, which included ideas like self-determination for nations, free trade, and a League of Nations to prevent future wars. Clemenceau, called the Tiger, wanted revenge against Germany for the terrible destruction in France. Lloyd George tried to balance between punishing Germany and keeping it strong enough to resist communism spreading from Russia. Orlando hoped to gain land for Italy. Germany was not invited to the talks. Instead, it was told to accept whatever terms the Allies decided. When German representatives were finally shown the treaty in June 1919, they were shocked. The treaty placed almost all blame for the war on Germany and its allies. Article 231, known as the War Guilt Clause, forced Germany to accept full responsibility for starting the war. This was deeply humiliating and became one of the most controversial parts of the treaty. The treaty also imposed harsh punishments. Germany had to give up territory, including Alsace-Lorraine, to France, and parts of Prussia to the new nation of Poland. Its overseas colonies were taken away and handed to Britain, France, and Japan. The German army was cut to only 100,000 men. Its navy was limited, and it was forbidden from having an air force or submarines. The Rhineland, a key industrial region, was demilitarized. Perhaps the most painful burden was reparations. Germany was ordered to pay billions in compensation to the Allies for the damage caused by the war. These payments devastated Germany's already weak economy and caused resentment for years to come. The treaty also created new nations out of the ruins of empires. Austria-Hungary was broken apart, leading to countries like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. Poland, which had not existed for over a century, was reborn. The Ottoman Empire lost nearly all of its land outside Turkey. The Middle East was divided into territories controlled by Britain and France. The League of Nations was established as part of the treaty, Wilson's dream of an international organization to maintain peace. Many hoped it would prevent another global conflict. However, the US Senate refused to join, weakening the League from the start. For many Germans, the Treaty of Versailles felt like a betrayal. They called it a diktat, or a dictated peace, since they had no say in its terms. Anger over the treaty fueled political unrest, weakened the new Weimar Republic, and gave extremists like Adolf Hitler a powerful rallying cry in the years ahead. The Treaty of Versailles was supposed to bring lasting peace. Instead, it left bitterness and division. While the world moved on, the seeds of future conflict were already planted in the soil of 1919. When World War I finally ended in 1918, the world was left to count the cost. The war had not just redrawn maps or toppled empires, it had destroyed millions of lives and left deep scars on an entire generation. The human toll of the conflict was staggering, and its effects reached far beyond the battlefields. In total, more than 65 million men served as soldiers during the war. Of these, around 10 million were killed, and another 20 million were wounded. Many survivors carried their injuries for life, missing limbs, shattered bones, and disfigured faces. Medical technology had advanced, with the war doctors developed new surgical techniques and improved care for the wounded, but the sheer number of casualties was overwhelming. Hospitals were crowded, and even the best doctors could not save everyone. Beyond the physical wounds, there were also invisible injuries. Soldiers who lived through years of shelling, gas attacks, and constant fear often returned home with what was called shell shock. Today, we know it as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Men who had once been strong and confident were left trembling, unable to sleep, or haunted by nightmares. At the time, many did not understand these conditions, and soldiers were sometimes treated as cowards instead of victims. The civilian population suffered terribly as well. In Belgium, northern France, Poland, and other war zones, villages were burned, farms destroyed, and families displaced. Millions became refugees, wandering from place to place in search of safety. At the Ottoman Empire, ethnic violence erupted. The most tragic example was the Armenian genocide of 1916, in which up to 1.5 million Armenians were killed or driven from their homes. Hunger and disease also claimed countless lives. The British blockade caused severe shortages in Germany and Austria-Hungary, leading to malnutrition, especially among children. And in 1918, just as the war was ending, the world was struck by the Spanish flu pandemic. Soldiers crowded in trenches and camps carried the virus across the globe. It killed an estimated 50 million people, far more than the war itself. For many families, the flu brought grief on top of already unimaginable losses. The emotional scars ran deep. In Europe, nearly every village had lost young men. Monuments were built in towns and cities listing the names of the dead, sometimes hundreds from the same community. Families lived with empty chairs at dinner tables. Widows wore black for the rest of their lives, and children grew up without fathers. Writers and poets who survived, like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, described the war not with pride, but with sorrow and anger. Their words captured the disillusionment of a generation that had been promised glory but found only death. The war also left behind a generation of lost youth. Men who survived often returned to find their jobs gone, their homes destroyed, or their futures uncertain. Many felt disconnected from civilian life after years in the trenches. The world they returned to seemed changed forever. The human cost of World War I was not just measured in numbers. It was measured in broken families, shattered bodies, and wounded minds. It was a tragedy felt in every city, every village, and every home touched by the war. An entire generation bore its weight, and the pain would echo through history for decades to come. When the guns fell silent in 1918, the Great War left behind more than destruction. It reshaped the entire world. The legacy of World War I was not only visible in ruined cities and lost lives, but also in the way nations governed, societies lived, and the global order was built. It was a turning point in history, and its effects are still felt today. One of the most important legacies was the fall of empires. 4 great empires collapsed under the weight of war: the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian. Their defeat and breakup created new nations like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Turkey. Borders across Europe and the Middle East were redrawn, often without considering the cultures and histories of the people living there. These new boundaries created tensions that would later lead to future conflicts. Another legacy was the rise of new political movements. In Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 created the world's first communist state. The ideas of Lenin, and later Stalin, would shape global politics for the entire 20th century. In Italy and Germany, anger over the war and the Treaty of Versailles fueled the rise of fascism. Leaders like Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler took advantage of wounded national pride and economic hardship to gain power. The seeds of World War II were planted in the aftermath of World War I. The war also changed society. For the first time, women worked in factories, offices, and farms in large numbers, filling roles left by men who had gone to fight. Their contribution gave strength to the women's suffrage movement. In countries like Britain and the United States, women gained the right to vote shortly after the war. This was a major step toward gender equality. The war also transformed attitudes toward government. People had seen how governments could mobilize entire nations through rationing, propaganda, and conscription. Some gained faith in the power of government to shape society, while others grew wary of how much control leaders could exert. The war also showed the danger of unchecked nationalism and blind loyalty to leaders. Culturally, the war created a lost generation. Writers, artists, and poets who experienced the trenches expressed disillusionment with old values of honor and glory. Novels like All Quiet on the Western Front and the poetry of Wilfred Owen captured the horror and futility of industrial war. Art movements like Dada and Surrealism reflected the chaos and confusion of the times. The international system also changed. The creation of the League of Nations was meant to prevent future wars through diplomacy and collective security, though it was weak and eventually failed. It set the stage for the later creation of the United Nations after World War II, the idea that nations could work together. For peace was one of the war's most important, if fragile, legacies. Finally, the war left behind a legacy of memory. Cemeteries, monuments, and annual rituals like Armistice Day reminded the world of the cost of war. The red poppy became a symbol of remembrance, honoring those who died in the fields of Europe. The words "never again" echoed across nations. Even as history marched toward another global conflict just 2 decades later, the Great War changed politics, society, and culture in ways no one had imagined in 1914. It ended an old world of empires and traditions and opened the door to a new, uncertain age. It was supposed to be the war to end all wars, but instead, it became a grim warning of what modern warfare could unleash. When people think of World War I, they often picture muddy trenches in France or massive battles in Belgium. But the war was far bigger than Europe, because Britain, France, and other powers controlled huge empires. They drew millions of soldiers from Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and the Pacific into the conflict. These men fought and died far from home, often overlooked in history books. Yet their role was vital to the war effort. In Africa, battles were fought in German colonies such as Cameroon, Togoland, and German East Africa, modern Tanzania. Allied force, British, French, Belgian, South African, and Portuguese launched campaigns to seize these territories. Fighting in Africa was brutal, not only because of combat, but also because of disease, hunger, and exhaustion. In German East Africa, General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck led a long guerrilla campaign with a small German force and tens of thousands of African soldiers called Ascoris. He tied down Allied troops until the war's very end, making it one of the longest and hardest campaigns. Millions of African civilians were forced to carry supplies, and many died from famine and disease. In Asia, Britain and France called upon their colonies for manpower. Over 1 million Indian soldiers served in the war. They fought in France, Belgium, the Middle East, and Africa. Indian troops faced freezing winters in Europe, a climate completely different from their homeland. Many showed incredible bravery, winning medals for courage, but they also faced racism and discrimination from the very empires they were defending. The French brought soldiers from North and West Africa, including Algeria, Morocco, Senegal, and Mali. Known as Tirailleurs Sénégalais and other colonial units, they fought in some of the toughest battles on the Western Front. For many of these men, it was their first time outside Africa, and they were shocked by the destruction of modern war. Still, they fought loyally, though often treated as second class by the French command. From the Pacific and the Caribbean, soldiers and workers also joined the war. Troops from Australia and New Zealand enthusiasts became famous at Gallipoli and later fought in Europe. Men from Canada, South Africa, Jamaica, and other colonies filled the ranks of the British Army. Even China, though not directly part of the fighting, sent around 140,000 Chinese laborers to work in France, digging trenches, repairing roads, and clearing battlefields. For many colonial soldiers, the war was a deeply mixed experience. On the one hand, they gained pride from serving, and some hoped that their loyalty would earn respect or even independence for their nations. On the other hand, they endured prejudice, lower pay, and harsher conditions than European troops. After the war, many returned home to find their sacrifices forgotten or ignored. The forgotten fronts remind us that World War I was truly global. It was not only Europeans who fought and died, but people from every corner of the world. Their contributions fed the armies, strengthened the empires, and kept the war machine running. Yet their stories often remain in the shadows of history. Remembering them gives us a fuller picture of what the Great War really was, a world war in every sense. When the First World War ended in November 1918, people across the globe were left not only with ruins and grief, but also with a burning need to remember. The war had claimed millions of lives, destroyed empires, and scarred entire nations. It was unlike anything the world had ever experienced, and no one wanted its sacrifices to be forgotten. Over the following years, memory of the war took shape through memorials, literature, poetry, and annual traditions that continue even today. One of the most visible ways the war was remembered was through monuments and cemeteries. Across Europe, thousands of memorials were built in villages, towns, and cities. Nearly every community in Britain, France, and Germany had a plaque or stone carved with the names of the dead. Families who had lost loved ones with no known grave could at least see their names honored. The Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, created first in France and Britain in 1920, symbolized the sacrifice of all those who never returned. In Arlington, Virginia, the United States built its own version in 1921. These unknown soldiers represented the countless men who vanished in the chaos of war, never to be identified. Cemeteries near the old battlefields became sacred ground. In places like Flanders, Verdun, and the Somme, rows of white crosses stretched as far as the eye could see. They stood not only as graves, but also as silent reminders of the cost of war. The phrase, "lest we forget," became a powerful motto of remembrance. Literature and art also played a huge role in shaping memory. The war produced a generation of writers and poets who tried to capture its horror and futility. British poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon wrote haunting verses about mud, blood, and wasted youth. Owen's line, "The old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria more," it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country, exposed the false promises of glory. Novels such as All Quiet on the Western Front by Erich Maria Remarque gave voice to German soldiers who felt just as broken and betrayed. Painters too, like Otto Dix, created disturbing images of ruined landscapes and mutilated bodies, showing the world the true face of industrial war. Annual rituals of remembrance were established. Armistice Day, November 11th, became a time to honor the dead. In Britain and the Commonwealth, People began wearing the red poppy, inspired by the poem in Flanders Fields. The fragile flower, which grew on battle-scarred ground, became a symbol of life, death, and remembrance. Even today, millions wear poppies each November. In the United States, November 11th eventually became Veterans Day. The cultural impact of World War was also seen in how societies thought about war itself. Before 1914, many saw war as noble and heroic. After 1918, it was remembered as tragic and senseless. The phrase "the lost generation" described the millions of young men who never returned and the despair of those who survived but felt disillusioned. The war changed how people viewed authority, nationalism, and the promises of leaders. Even more than a century later, the memory of World War I continues. Monuments stand tall, poetry is still read, and people gather every year to honor those who gave their lives. The Great War taught humanity painful lessons about the cost of modern conflict. Remembering it is not only about honoring the past, but also about reminding ourselves of the dangers of forgetting what unchecked violence can do to the world.